All right, everybody. Good to see you all. If you don't mind just typing into the chat your name and where you're from and what subject you teach, that would be great for me to have a reference of that before we begin. Thank you so much. Good to see everybody. Fellow chemistry teacher, yes. I live in Petaluma.
All right.
I live on Olive Street. Where do you live?
Oh my gosh, I can walk to your house. I live on Bachelor Terrace.
Oh my gosh, where do you teach at?
The Spring Hill School.
Oh, my daughter's going there next year.
Woo, nice.
She's starting 6th grade there next year.
Nice. Great.
Jen is a really good friend of mine.
Okay, all right.
That's hilarious.
That's good.
Great. I love La Jolla. I almost went to college at UC San Diego. Okay. All right, everyone. Well, I'm going to go ahead and begin. So a few disclaimers before we start this session. One is this is part 2 of a 3-part masterclass on inquiry learning and inquiry learning cycles. If you were not present at the first session, I'm going to review a little bit of what we talked about, and I'm also going to direct you to a link where you can find that recording if you haven't seen it already. The other thing that's a disclaimer is this is a session sponsored by Microsoft, and I use a lot of Microsoft tools, Flipgrid, etc. in my own classroom. The school that I teach at is a Google school. So when I teach at a school called Sonoma Academy in Santa Rosa, California, and when I show a few examples from my classroom with respect to distance learning, those are going to be shown using Google tools and some Google Forms. So I just want to make sure I put that out up front, that I'm doing that with respect to authenticity. Also, I'm going to be sharing my slides, but I also have another computer open with the chat. So although I'm going to be in full screen, I will be able to reply to your chats. So feel free to do that spontaneously, and just feel free to unmute yourself and speak and ask a question if you need to. I've done so much professional development that I realize now that after an hour, there's not a ton of collaboration that can happen and not a ton of interactivity. And one of the most powerful things I can do for you is really spark your curiosity and model some examples for you, although I will open up time for Q&A at the end. So this is going to be very presentation-y, but please know that you can interrupt me at any time before we begin. So I'm going to go ahead and get started here. This is my website, cyclesoflearning.com. I will post the recording of this presentation there, as well as a link to my book and TED Talk, which you can find there. Both talk directly about the concepts that we're going to be addressing today. The book is a workbook style for teachers that want to embark on inquiry learning in their classroom. So that's all there, and everything I'm going to talk about today is touched on in that book. So review of class number 1. Class number 1 was called The Call to Adventure. And what I'm doing in calling things by this language, I'm trying to ground inquiry learning in something very tangible that we all know is motivating, and that's storytelling. And if you go to the website q.org/Microsoft, and just search for my name or go to recordings of presentations, you'll be able to find that last recording. As well, I'm going to push these slides out to you at the end, and where it says call to adventure underline, that is going to be a clickable link where it will take you directly to the presentation from last week. So what we talked about last time was this interesting overlap between something very mythical and something that's very pervasive in society, and that's the hero's journey, right? This idea of storytelling according to these tenets that we sort of just fall into. And we paralleled that to an example of a learning structure, a learning cycle. In this case, I have a very standard inquiry learning cycle that I know fellow chemistry teachers have seen before, and that's the 5E learning cycle. Modeling instruction, guided inquiry, etc. All different kinds of models, POGL, whatever we're involved in, all sort of follow this same outline. And where we started last class is we said, you know, in the hero's journey, we call this first phase the call to adventure, whereas in the inquiry learning cycle, we refer to it as the moment of engagement. Right, but we really can think about it in the same light as we think about storytelling. There is something that we want our students to, there is an information gap that we want to become salient for our students. Okay, so for Daniel LaRusso in Karate Kid, the information gap was, I don't know karate, but I need to know karate in order to exist in this little Hollywood world that's been created for me. In our classroom, we want our students to recognize that they have an information gap, let's say with balancing a chemical reaction, right? There's no real difference here. We want them to recognize that information gap initially on their own. The hero has been challenged to have to negotiate that information gap, right? Go into this unknown world without the tools. And we call that moment the moment of exploration with our students. So we want them to explore these information gaps. And that's what we're really going to tackle today. In the next class, we're going to talk about, okay, so what happens then when the mentor shows up and then tries to transform the students, have them elaborate their content, where they then return home to be evaluated. So the first class was really strategies around this idea of sparking curiosity, but that really being the purpose of that being to make an information gap salient to our students, to perplex them, but also to motivate them to then go and explore the world, which is what we're going to get into today. I showed this diagram last time, which overlaps those two cycles, and I keep harping on this structure because for me, you know, what I'm going to do when I get offline with you today is I'm going to start writing distance learning modules for my chemistry classes because I'm in California and we're distance learning for I don't know how long. And I'll be using this structure. And I find that as I quoted last time, you know, it's through intense structure that we find the safety to be creative. And that's from John Stewart. So I find that this structure is a really powerful one that grounds me right now in my lesson planning through a lens of motivation. So I really like that. So before we move on to class number 2, are there any questions that people have or things they've been thinking about since our last class that they would like me to address? And they can be anything. Just go ahead and unmute yourself, and I'll give you about 10 seconds to ask a question, and if we don't have any at that point, I'm going to go ahead and move on.
Oh, Ramsey?
Yeah.
I was just wondering, the last time I didn't get the slides from the last presentation.
I'm
there
sorry.
a way to...
I'll put those in the chat at the end today as well.
Oh, okay. Okay, so for both of them, for today and tomorrow.
I'll put both of them in there. I'm sorry about that.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, so At the end of last class, we ended with a challenge, and the challenge looked like this. I basically asked people to identify a topic in your curriculum that is challenging for your students, describe the topic below, and then create an image or video clip that sparks student curiosity about your chosen topic. And we had a few responses. I'm going to just highlight one here from Melanie. She said persecution of early Christians in the Roman Empire, for lack of a better idea right now, but I really appreciate you participating in this. She couldn't find a cool Indiana Jones scene like I showed last time. No problem at all. Or the apparently deleted scene from Gladiator, so she settled for this clip right here. I'll play a little bit of it. Right, so I mean, it's really great that that question that just popped up, why are they being fed to the lions? That would be the kind of thing, if I was showing that for my students, I might have that clip playing on loop as they walk in and not have that question there, but I would have a Google form where they have to, or any form where they have to put in their proposed questions, and then I might make a word cloud out of that and see what questions pop to the top, and then that's going to lead to their further exploration. So thank you, Melanie, that was really great, although albeit kind of disturbing, but that's okay. So class number 2, the challenge. Okay, so I'm going to refer back to this quote by Wallace. Great writers, comedians, and magicians have a lot in common. All depend on a certain quantity of vital information removed from, but evoked by, a communication in such a way as to cause a kind of explosion of associative connections within the recipient. So whether it's distance learning or in-class learning, I can't think of a better thing to do than to do this. You know, Wallace is referring to trying to write a book like Infinite Jest, which is thousands of pages long, but get the reader to want to do the work. Whereas for me, I want to think about my lesson as containing a lot of complexity that they have to negotiate. However, I want them to want to do the work. So today we're going to be talking about this idea of evoked. Like, what does that mean? How can we get it to surface? How can we get their ideas to surface? And we'll be focusing on this portion, the challenge. So this is the question that I want to pose to you right now. What is the purpose of the challenge phase as it applies to lesson design? So what I'd like you to do is take a minute to reflect on this. And then I would like you to please type your answer into the chat. Okay, and I'm assuming everybody can see my slides. I do have a note from Ed saying that he cannot see the presentation. So if you cannot, please corroborate that comment in the chat. If you can see my slides, you cannot either. So can everybody see, can type into the chat if you can see the slides? I'm sharing my screen. You should be able to. Okay, thanks, Sarah. Okay, so I'm going to keep going here, Ed, knowing that the presentation is being recorded. Okay, and since others can, I'm going to have it recorded. And then what I can do, though, is that you can just shoot me an email, or you can go and check out the recording of it, and you'll be able to see it from there. But I'm going to keep going here. All right, so back to my question. What is the purpose of the challenge phase as it applies to lesson design? Okay, so students' curiosity has been sparked, and now we're going to take that curiosity and we're going to have them do something with it. Okay, go ahead and reflect on this and type something into the chat, and I'm going to hang out here for a minute while you do that.
Ramsey, could you repeat that question again, please?
Okay, can you see it on the screen?
Oh, that's the question. Okay, thank you.
What is the purpose of the challenge phase as it applies to lesson design? So if we reflect back to that hero's journey model that I showed, students have been engaged, their curiosity has been sparked, and this was the focus of last class. Okay, now we're moving into the challenge. Let's try and be specific though. What are we trying to do to our students during this phase? Because it's probably the most challenging of the phases of the lesson cycle. James says, align their curiosity with a particular topic subject being studied. Yvonne says, create a series of experiences which will help students to answer their curiosity. Pam from Petaluma says, give them an opportunity to delve into the idea or question that sparked their interest. Sarah said, it's where you challenge their understanding by giving them a task. Great. And Ed is with us. I'm so glad. I know that it's a team. Not everybody might be accustomed to Teams. I think we've all been using various things like Zoom or Google Meet over the course of this emergency distance learning. So I'm gonna not give you my definition just yet, but I'm gonna try and evoke that here by going through a couple case studies right now. So this first case study comes from a middle school math classroom. What I'm going to do is I'm going to focus on the first two parts of the inquiry cycle and then try and deconstruct it a little bit. So what I'm going to be doing is doing two case studies, and neither of them are chemistry per se. I'm going to really try and do a math one and a humanities one because I have so many chemistry examples and biology examples, and I think we can really do some brainstorming around that, and I'm happy to stay online and talk more about that, but I want to make sure that I address other subjects as well. So this is a middle school math simulation. I'm not going to have you go through the simulation. I'm just going to do it and then talk meta about what I'm hoping would happen. Okay, so again, I'm going to show you the first phases of it and then kind of talk and demonstrate what I'm hoping would emerge from students during that time. Okay, so the lesson starts like this. I'm going to play the clip for you.
Making the big romantic gesture. That's powerful. Verizon. Get a Droid Razr M by Motorola in pink for $49.99.
Okay, so if you didn't catch it here, the clip was shown, and then we see this heart shape being drawn around it right here. Okay, so what I would do when I was helping a teacher that I was working, I was a bits mentor for a teacher who was working through this lesson, and the teacher had this playing on loop as the students walked in, and then just prompted the students to say by saying, what are you curious about? So in her lesson plan, this literally says this is the call to adventure, or this is the first E phase. Show clip, on loop, ask students, what are they curious about? Okay. And then in this case, they were answering these curiosities in a Google form, right? So here's the Google form. What are you curious about? Students then type them in. The reason we chose to use a Google form is because I think there's some cases when you're trying to spark student curiosity when you want everybody to hear other people's questions. And this is a huge thing when we talk about our last class. If there's a curiosity spark or some sort of moment of engagement, and I say to students, what questions do you have? Or what are you curious about? And I know that their questions are all going to be fairly similar. I don't want them to publicly hear each other say them, because then they're going to be they're going to be demotivated because they know someone else has the same question they did. So in that case, I'll give them a Google form and have them submit them privately. But if their questions are going to be very different, I might have us share them publicly so that we have sort of a discourse and discussion that happens in the classroom. So that distinction between do I want their curiosities to be expressed publicly or privately is a subtle lesson planning strategy. So in this case, I had them do them privately, or I haven't yet talked about what the lesson is guiding students towards. Okay, and here we see a lot of their responses. Okay, in this Google form. Okay, so rather than have the teacher read all these responses, we want the teacher to manipulate the students into convincing them that they're asking the question she wants them to ask. Okay, so, and we haven't shared what that question is yet, but one strategy is just to copy them all and then make a word cloud out of them. And we'll talk about word clouds a little bit more in a sec. I love this tool called Word Sift instead of Wordle. It's an HTML5 tool, so it works on any device. So I put these in here and I hit Sift, and it's going to create a data visualization about their questions, okay? So recall, the curiosity spark showed some hipster guy riding a bike around San Francisco and then sent a text to what we think is, his friend or his girlfriend or his wife that shows a heart-shaped ride, right? So then these are the most common words used in the students' questions. Heart, ride, take, long, route. So then as you see, there's all kinds of other stuff here, like girl, figure, relationship, variety. Like, I don't want to focus on those, but the question that I want them to ask is, how long does it take him to ride the heart, okay? Or how far, right here, did he ride to make the heart, right? So I have those questions right there. How long, how far was that? Now, there's a lot of other questions. Students are curious about what application the person used. But as you see here, the most common questions had to do with things related to length. How long or far did it take to make the heart, right? So I can ask students that, and then what we have here is this question, how far did he ride? So in the back of my mind, the teacher knew what question she was going to ask, but the curiosity spark and the subsequent method for getting them to answer that spark was so salient, so well strategized that the students ask the question you want them to ask, which is the whole point. If they own that question, it's so much better. Again, though, this isn't discovery learn. Like, I don't want them doing random stuff. I want them going down this task. And if they don't ask, how far did he ride? I will ask it, right? And that happens all the time. But I want them to come up with it on their own. Okay, so we're still in class 1, right? So now the question is, how far did he ride, right? So now we're going to embark into that next part. And in order to do that, we go now into the challenge element, where the students are now given the task to figure out how far did he ride. And in order to do that, I didn't want to give them too much information. This was a 7th grade class. So we gave them 2 pieces of information. We gave them this diagram right here, which is a zoomed in picture of the heart. Okay. Without a scale, if this was an elementary school classroom, I might give them the scale. So zoomed in picture of the heart over San Francisco, okay? And then gave them a Google form to put in their answers. Okay, and some hidden things here. I gave them the task of recording their answers in a bunch of different units without saying it. So there was this hidden agenda of having them do some unit conversions, even if it was online. So their curiosity was sparked to ask the question. They were manipulated into asking the question, how far did he ride? A lot of them want to know how fast he went. Or how long did it take, but we convinced them they need to answer the question, how far first. And then we give them some tools to answer that question. This is the challenge, okay? We give them a picture of it and a place to put their answer. And then I say, you have your computers, you have whatever you want. Go for it. 30 minutes, okay? So 30 minutes is up and students then share their answers. So here's the actual answer, which you can find online. Actually, they don't know this. That's 27 miles long. But here are some things students did. So one thing a lot of students did is they got out maps and driving directions, and they dropped pins to create a similar heart around San Francisco. As you can see, this person came up with 30 miles, 30.2 miles. They actually have it taking 10 hours because they have it set on walking instead of driving, which created this opportunity to talk about speed as well. Here's another one students did. In this case, we have 23 miles. So the actual, if you remember, was 27. This person had 30, and this person had 23 miles. So then we had this really nice discussion about, okay, why was this one here a lot shorter? So it allowed us to talk about GPS and that idea of as the crow flies, and all this really interesting stuff. So without telling students, a lot of them immediately started using mapping tools on their computer to solve this problem. Okay, so let's analyze this lesson in terms of the first two parts. This initial part was the call to adventure. How far did he ride? That was the moment of challenge. Okay, so the real question is, what is the mentor's task now, right? Now the students have done this task. What is the mentor's task now? And this is really an interesting thing, because in teaching this way, we are not telling the students the learning objective up front. They might know that they're doing a lesson, you know, and they have their book or whatever, but we're not advertising to the students, by the end of this, you are going to be able to do this, because the whole thing is for the mentor to sort of unveil that as if they were telling a story. So this is going to be the focus of the next class, but I'll allude to you that this could have gone in a couple different directions, right? This entire lesson could have been about mapping tools, right? And by asking the students the question that way, we tunneled them into mapping tools or using mapping tools. In this case, this lesson ended up being a lesson about circumference. It was a Common Core math lesson about circumference. Little did the students know in this case that they were actually embodying this idea of the distance around something, or this idea of the circumference of something. So then after that, the teacher then would lead them into a lesson on circumference, and give them some tools and equations that they could have used to solve that problem without having to use the mapping tool. By starting with that complex task and moving then towards those lower end Bloom's tools, it creates sort of a nice driving the students towards those tools rather than giving them those tools initially. Before we go into the second case study, and by the way, this is just in the middle of this, right? Like the hero has yet to be transformed. We haven't talked about the mentor, but we're now at this point where we've sort of tunneled the students to this thing they don't know yet. And that's the way I like to think of the purpose of the challenge. We're not just giving them a task based on their curiosity. We're giving them a task with some tools. We gave them a map, but those tools, the purpose of the task is to tunnel them now to their misconceptions, get them into a space where they realize, okay, I need some more tools in order to solve this correctly, right? My answers are not aligning with that actual answer. What's the problem? What information do I still not need? So the mentor can appear and deliver that information. Thinking of a lecture as spackle instead of paint, if you will. Does anybody have any questions about that first case study before we move on to a humanities example? Okay, great. All right, so case study number 2 is an example from a humanities classroom. This is from our, at the school that I teach at, our junior year, which we have a program called Humanities that mixes English and history, right? So it's just one class. And this kind of is the year where they're studying America, right? And the driving question of that year is, what is America? This is the year that students in that class would self-study for the AP US History exam if they wanted to. So the first thing the teacher did, I worked side by side with the teacher in coming up with this example, is the teacher created 2 word clouds using the tool that I just showed you, okay? And just showed these word clouds to the students. So we have a word cloud on the left and we have a word cloud on the right. And I did talk about this spark in our last example, okay? And just have those up there and asking the students, what are you curious about? And this is a time, unlike the last one, when the answers are really varied and they start to feed off each other. So we don't want students answering this privately. So the teacher just said, shout out, what are you curious about? And I was sitting in the back of the classroom when this was happening, and students were saying things like, what are those? Is this a word cloud? Teacher would say, yes, it is a word cloud. Are they from songs? No. Are they, basically turning it into a riddle. Or eventually the students would say, are they from speeches? And the teacher would say, yes, they are from speeches. And then ask a more directed question. What speeches are they from? Okay. So then students started yelling out, like, they're from this speech, they're from that speech. It's Abraham Lincoln, it's George Washington. And then the teacher said, the speech on the left is from one politician, the speech on the right is from another politician. And now we have about 15 to 20 minutes of class going so far that is really, really, really solid. Students are guessing. And then the teachers ask that pointed question. Now what I want you to do is tell me, make a guess. What is the text source on the left and what is the text source on the right? Right, and maybe gamify that a little bit, or provide some sort of incentive for the group that gets it right. At this point now, students start investigating them really closely. And if you remember the literature on sparking curiosity, it's like an inverted U, right? So when you have no information, you're not that curious. When you have all the information, you're not that curious. But when you have the intentional amount of information withheld, as J.J. Abrams said in our last class, we have max curiosity. So if you look really closely at the image on the left, you might see that word Romney right there at the bottom. And if you look really closely at the image on the right, you'll see things like president right there, or fantastic right there. So these are words we know on the right are said by Trump quite a bit, and on the left it's a little bit trickier, but we see that big hope right there. And we know that Obama was running against Romney. So turns out that the speech on the left, and this is that call to adventure phase, the speech on the left was Obama's inauguration speech, and the speech on the right was Trump's. So the teacher literally Googled Obama inauguration, made a word cloud out of it, Trump inauguration, made a word cloud out of it, and showed them, right? And they had this great class discussion about what do these sources tell us about their idea of America? Can we pull from these two sources these presidents' mission or the way that they define America from there? What does it tell us? We see words like special and hard and thank and tough and potential and tremendous on Trump's side, and we see words like best work, hope on Obama's side. So what can these tell us about these two men? And next question went to Stu. What I want you to do is find two speeches that, when compared, challenge our definition of America using the same method that the teacher showed. So they said, hey, here's what I did. I went online and I found two speeches and I made two word clouds out of them. And now I want you to do that. And this is that challenge piece. And I'm going to show you some student examples in a moment. But what's great about this is students are then now challenged to think about America, think about people in history or current day who have differing views on America, find some sort of seminal primary source from that person, and then make word clouds out of that, and then challenge the class to have discussions about it. So again, the teacher is tunneling the students towards this idea of what is America, this driving question, what is America, all without having delivered any direct instruction on this yet. I mean, given the question is a little bit more ambiguous than what is stoichiometry in chemistry, something that I love to drive students towards that question. In this case, they're given a challenge with limited information, but their curiosity is now sparked. So if we look at some of the students' responses to this, it's really fascinating. And I don't really know exactly, this is the teacher shared with me these right now. So this is one group created these two clouds. This other group created these two clouds. I don't know where these are from. Literally, this is the activity taken from the teacher's classroom. Here we have these two clouds. But when we look at them very closely and analyze them, a lot of things can come up. So this is that idea of really putting students, rather than teaching critical thinking, put students in a position where they have to think their way through something, where they have to analyze these common words. And by the way, we can do this in science. So, I mean, this tool can be used towards any concept where students have multiple ideas about the way a phenomenon works. So these are just really cool examples. And what was a hidden outcome? Students learned what a data visualization was. They learned how to take a screenshot. They learned all these tech tools as well. So these are really interesting ones. Okay, so what is the mentor's task now? So in the last class, the mentor now had to really solidify what were you actually doing? Let's put some labels on it. What you were doing was finding the distance around something. Well, oftentimes when that's a circle, we call that circumference. Let's derive a model or an equation we can use to find that. Let's use that model now to solve that problem. That was the mentor's task. In this one, the mentor's task now is to really guide the students towards answering that question. What is America told through the lens of people's history? Starting off with that task. So two very different subjects, both having the same purpose. Create questions, use those questions to drive students towards some sort of content through that challenge. It's very tangible to think about how we do this in chemistry. You know, what is the effect that salt has on the boiling point of water by giving students some salt and some beakers and some hot plates and some thermometers. But it's a lot more challenging to do this in subjects where it's not as, the hands-on aspect of it isn't as tangible. And I wanted to make sure that those were what we head down in this recording. Before I move on, does anybody have any questions about that case study? Okay. Okay. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you 2 examples about how I'm structuring this, the first 2 phases, right? I'm going to keep unveiling it, but how this is showing up in my current distance learning as a chemistry and biology teacher. So last spring, like probably all of you, I had 2 days to design a 10-week-long fully online version of my classes. It was completely triage. And I actually really enjoyed it. It was really, I don't know. I really enjoyed that challenge of trying to figure out how to do something differently. Although the situation was horrible and dark, for me, it re-energized me as a lesson designer a little bit. So example number 3, this is fully online last spring. So what I'm going to do is pull up an example from my I taught an advanced biochemistry class last spring, and I want to show you the way that I set up my class for distance learning and how I couch this idea of hero's journey in it. So I'm going to talk about this class here. I have it highlighted right now. This is where it says Tuesday 5/12, week 7. So the way that I structured my online learning is what we had is 2-hour blocks of time with our students in our distance learning. And I'm just explaining my situation. And what I did is I set up each class to be mini little hero's journey cycles. But I never use that language with my students. I don't want my students thinking about pedagogy. I just want them learning in a simple fashion. So what I did is I just used a simple Google Doc for each day. So students would come here to Tuesday 5/12. They'd click on check-in. It says whether or not the check-in is going to be a Zoom or not a Zoom. So in this case, there was no live Zoom to this check-in. The purpose of the check-in, as you see over here, is the call to adventure. So what I'm thinking about is I'm going to use this phase right now to call students to adventure about what they're going to do for the next 2 hours. I'm going to spark their curiosity about it. So in this example here, this is a lesson that's going to be about, in my biochemistry class, about colorimetry or Beer's law, spectrophotometry. So they click on this link, and what I used is I used Google Forms for everything. So they would click on the link, and they would fill out this Google form. So they tell me their name. What I'm doing here is reviewing their last class, and I'm getting them to look here about this methemoglominia, which is a blood disorder that we were looking at related to hemoglobin. And then I'm getting them to investigate some stuff about hemoglobin here. A lot of this is review from the previous class. And then I'm asking them this question that when they read this linked article here, is really getting them to investigate this idea about what is causing this this discoloration in the skin, and that's going to be getting them to make hypotheses about discoloration, right? Which is going to lead down the line to where this lesson is eventually going, which is how does a pulse oximeter work, right? And a pulse oximeter works using the feature of colorimetry. So I read their responses here, and then after that, they move to the lesson portion here. Now, the lesson portion here is the challenge. I call it a lesson, but to them, what I'm really trying to do in this moment online is I am challenging them now to learn some tools that are going to get them to understand colorimetry, right? This is that challenge piece. I'm tunneling them towards Beer's law, without them knowing what Beer's Law is. You're probably wondering what's happening here. So I'm doing this asynchronously, but it's happening in this block between 9 and 11. So since there was no live Zoom at the beginning of class, there is a room up above here, you can see, where they enter, and I'm hanging out in that room if they have any questions as they go through this. If it was a live Zoom, I would then say, everybody check out this picture. What questions do you have? Okay, log off and go now do the lesson. So if I click on this lesson, it opens up into another Google form. And in this Google form here, they watch this video, and this video is going to teach them how to use this simulation, which is a PhET simulation that they are now going to go do by clicking on this link. And then I ask them these questions about the simulation, and they hit submit. So I recorded a screencast of me teaching them how to do the simulation, and then they go and do it. And they play with wavelength, and they play with transmittance and absorbance, and they come to the realization that different solutions based on their color can absorb light or transmit light differently, all the while prepping themselves for how this might apply to the next lesson at hand, which is the checkout, which we will be talking about in our next class. So that's one example of how I was doing it in the distance space. I was using Zoom or using just a Google form response to spark their curiosity, and then using a online simulation to embed it in the Google form to challenge them, all the while using the form as an accountability measure where I can see their responses as we go through that. Does anybody have any questions about that simulation as it applies to distance learning and how I was trying to establish that learning cycle?
I have a question.
Sure.
About your check-ins, and that some are live and some are not live, and how did you set that up at the beginning? And I know you have high school, so it's different because I have middle school, but if you could go into that a little bit more.
Sure. So what I what I did is I want to say that I'm a firm believer that structure is by far the absolute structure, and simplicity with technology nothing is more important than in the distance learning setting than that. So what I decided to do was make this very simple Google Doc that you're looking at right now. That is, I just kept building it, right? So each day I would build these forms and I would start these check-ins. So the very first class, I sent an email to the students and we met in Zoom, and I walked them through how I was going to be teaching the class. And I said, okay, so here's the way each day is going to go. You're going to have 3 links every class. The first link is going to be called the check-in. The second link is going to be called the lesson. And the third link is going to be called the checkout. And each link is going to go to a form that you fill out. And in that form, there's going to be links to readings, and there's going to be links to videos, but they're all going to be in the form, right? So they would click on this, and it would go to a form. And that form, they'd have to fill out. Actually, I know that's not loading. So I first walk them through that. So here's an example of that where this asks them to watch this video about messenger RNA, and then it asks them some questions about it, all designed to get them thinking and their curiosity sparked about messenger RNA. So I had one whole class where I walked them through this lesson. And then I said, okay, so in this, what you're going to see is the only place I'm going to do a live Zoom would be in the check-in. That's what I decided with them. I said, I'm only going to do live Zoom with you in the check-in. Everything else is going to be asynchronous. And I said, that means that I'm going to be available in the Zoom room if you have questions, but these are tasks that you're going to be walking through. So I said, I'll just label it. If there's no live Zoom, that means there's a form you fill out. If there is a live Zoom, that means that I'm going to be doing this thing live. And the purpose of that first part is to get you interested about the lesson. So then when I was doing my design, I just had to think to myself, okay, can this happen without me being there? or do I need to show them this? Like, for example, a lot of times what I would do is I would do a demo. Like, I remember one class, in my chemistry class, we were talking about density, and I just literally had a can of Coke and a can of Diet Coke and a big glass, and I dumped them both in, and they saw that the Diet Coke sunk faster than the regular Coke. Or, I mean, the regular Coke sunk faster than the Diet Coke, and we just literally had a conversation about that. So I asked myself, can I do this live? Can this Curiosity Spark be done live, or does it need to be, is it something they can do on their own just by participating in the Google form? So I asked myself that question, and usually the answer was either, yeah, it needs to be live, or I really just need to see them. I need to see their faces. I'm missing them. So I would do it live there no matter what. So I really asked myself those two questions. I chose this because I felt like my students were having Zoom fatigue. You know, all their teachers were Zooming so much that I didn't want to fatigue them with it. So I really just told myself, as long as I have one anchor a week. So here in week 3, you see I have one live Zoom there, none there, or 2 there, 1 there. So I use the Curiosity Spark as my way of Zooming with them in a really fun, authentic way. And then I used exploration and then recorded videos of myself to really hammer in any other information. And then I hung out in the Zoom room if they had questions. I will say I probably had about 20% of my students just never leave the Zoom room the whole time. They just would hang out there. So it forced me to be present, but it also allowed me to like go on a walk, you know, and have my phone with me in my Zoom room if I needed to do that. Does that answer your question?
Yes, that's very helpful. And I also had those handful of students that even when you said go do stuff they needed that.
Yeah.
Bonding time.
I like that. What I was trying to do was build a relationship without doing a lot of live Zoom lecture. And then I would do recorded lecture. And we'll talk more about that next class. But that, you know, what I'm doing with my current chemistry class right now is I'm redesigning it, and I'm doing the whole thing just around the HTML5 PhET simulations. And I'm just designing lessons around those and finding Curiosity Sparks related to them, and just trying to make everything like Curiosity Spark PhET simulation follow-up instruction, Curiosity Spark PhET simulation follow-up instruction, to get it really structured for them in that context. And if you're a chemistry teacher listening, I really encourage you to use the HTML5 simulations because they'll show up on any device, phone, iPad. You don't need a Java applet. So with that said, why don't I show you the current document that I'm using right now to plan for. I start on August 17th. So this is where my thought process is right now. So what I'm about to show you is like literally a working document of how I'm planning on structuring my sophomore chemistry class with respect to this hero's journey template and we're going to focus on the first 2 things because it's the first 2 classes. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make this thing for each. I'm going to make one of these notebooks for each class. So in this case, this is Chemistry Notebook Unit 1, Atomic Structure. So I'm going to make this. I'm going to turn it into a template and give it to the students, and that's what they're going to be using. So I have these hyperlinks up here to each day. So day 1, what I also decided is I'm going to do the check-in, which is, you see on the right here. I actually have these comments here to tell me where I am in the hero's journey cycle. That's really, I'm so glad I put that actually for you right there. So students are going to open this up. It's going to have day 1 highlighted. And we're always going to start with a live Zoom. I'm going to do live Zoom for every check-in. So they're going to start with the live Zoom, and they're going to click here to access the room right here. In that Zoom room, I am then going to spark their curiosity somehow. I don't know yet how I'm going to do that. And then they're going to type their responses for that question into that box. Every kid will have their own document here. So with Atomic Structure, I'm thinking about using some spark about how small the atom really is. And then I'm going to show them some some video that's going to get them to be curious about that concept, and they'll be typing their questions into here. And this is just going to be a formative assessment tool for me, so I'll have all their documents back there. They'll then move into step 2, which is the simulation done individually. And you notice I have here, like, this first part is Zoom. The second part is individual. And this is where I'm going to then challenge them. So they're going to view a tutorial where I walk them through how to use the simulation. They're going to go into the simulation, and then they're going to answer these questions. And this is an atomic model simulation. So step 3 is for the next class next week. But this is how I'm planning on structuring each class. 3 steps: check-in, simulation, check-out. Check-in, Zoom Curiosity Spark, 10 minutes. They type their questions into here. They leave the Zoom room or stay. Boom, they move right into the simulation. The simulation is going to then get them trying to create models about the way the world works. Like, describe at least 3 ways the Rutherford model, atom model, and the plum pudding atom model are similar, right? Getting them to sort of think about this idea of charge as being a similar construct. And then I'm then going to move into later sort of that mentor role where I'm going to bring together that Rutherford model into a more concise understanding from a quantum perspective. And then I'm just going to do that. I can move into the next day. There's day 2. Check in Zoom. Boom. I'll have some sort of curiosity spark. Simulation individually. Boom. Go through that. Right. This one's broken out a little bit more. Check out. Boom. So that's my plan. And I'll talk more about that check out phase next class. Does anyone have any questions about that? Apologies for the Google Docs. I know it's a Microsoft workshop. You can just substitute that with Word, and it works just as fine. Cool. All right, so I, like last time, I had a challenge for you. I'll push these slides and the link to the last slides out in the chat when we're done, per request. But this class's challenge is to do the following. I'll read it to you. And by the way, it's totally optional. Identify a topic in your curriculum that is challenging for students. Describe the topic below. And then describe a challenge you could create for your students that both empowers them to seek answers but guides them towards misconceptions. And this cycles us back to that initial question I had for you. What is the purpose of the challenge? And I think it is 2 things. It empowers them to seek answers to their questions, or the question that you were trying to get them to ask, but it also tunnels them or guides them towards misconceptions. And this is the hard thing. We want our students to get it wrong here, because the more they get it wrong here, the more tension they're going to feel between the world as they know it and the world as it is. And that tension is something that we can really leverage. The trick is to not make that tension too tight, but to get them almost there, right? And there's a lot with chemistry. I find it's really easy because they can get there conceptually. Salt increases the boiling point of water. They can get that in terms of from an observation. But their conceptual understanding of why that works, or the ability to create a model that can quantitatively explain how that works specifically, isn't always right on. So there's always this conceptual framework that we can always we can continue to build in them. And I love at the end of the year asking them questions about, it's so funny when I ask them something like, what's in a bubble of boiling water? And they start drawing like hydrogen and stuff. And at the end of the year, they show these beautiful pictures of water molecules, and these dipole forces being strained. It's great when we start getting them to explain things conceptually and quantitatively, and then that provides such a beautiful window for us to give them that answer, rather than the other way around. I mean, I can't think of anything more boring for me as a teacher than them doing a lab just so that it proves what I already taught them. I'd rather have them do it so it surfaces ideas that I can then solidify or change or alter or modify into a more appropriate form. So I will put these slides in the chat, and you'll have that link right there if you'd like to participate in the challenge. Here is a link to today's slides. You could screenshot that or know that I'm going to put a link to the slides in the chat today as well. So that's going to be there, no problem for you. And are there any final questions from anybody before we move on? Please don't leave until I drop those 2 links for you. But any final questions?
Yeah. Is there a third part to this?
Oh, next Wednesday. Part 3.
Next Wednesday. And those questions you put up, can you put the links in the meeting chat to access them?
Yeah, I'm gonna put the slides to last class and this class in the chat.
Fantastic. Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, so I'm gonna go do that right now, everybody. And stay tuned for those. Let me just go into my Google Drive real quick. And I'm going to share both those slides with you. So hang tight. Sorry about that. What I'm going to do right now is just make a quick folder for you so you have it. I'm going to do that.
Another question I'd like to ask was, with distance learning, how do you get around practical skills and introducing practical ideas?
Yeah, so that's all. We're going from abstract to concrete. So what's going to happen after that is I'm going to then move into lecture and practice, right? And in distance learning, what I'm doing is I'm flipping that piece. So I'm giving them a recorded video of me or somebody else walking them through those, with then follow-up questions. In the case of last time, it was the Google form where those follow-up questions existed, or in this time I'm going to use that Google document. But yes, what's coming next now is all those lower Bloom's taxonomy type things related to equations and definitions and content and practice. But I think the main thing is that comes after the exploration, not before. In terms of the way that I like to promote it. So yes, there's going to be more focus on that next class.
Okay, great. Thank you.
You're welcome.
All our lessons are online, and that's a challenge we have, is to bring that practical element and understanding to our lessons.
Yeah.
So
absolutely.
Yeah.
All right, so I just shared with you guys in the chat the slides to last class and the slides to this, but also in the chat, if you go here, let me just put the website here. If you go to q.org/Microsoft, or you go to my website, cyclesoflearning.com, you'll find the recording of our last class, and then in about a day, you'll also find the recording to this class there.
Yeah, I watched the first one on YouTube, actually.
Okay. Okay, everybody, I got to go back to vacation with my family. I'll talk to you all later.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.